As part of the Career Development Series, we'll be looking at effective communication at all levels. Because as we all know, communication is the basis for all interactions, and if we get it wrong, it negatively impacts everything. But when we get it right, it enhances everything. So we all need to figure out how to get it right so we can continuously win in our workplace, especially in today's economy where everything is changing so rapidly. So with me to discuss this is Rolake Akinkugbe Filani. Rolake is an energy and infrastructure specialist, an award-winning versatile energy and infrastructure sector executive, and currently the Chief Commercial Officer at MIXTA. She's also the Senior Advisor on Energy to IFU, the Danish Investment Fund, an Executive Coach at iArticulate. Rolake is also on the Board of Trustees of WIMBIZ and a founding member of the Women in Energy Network, where she serves as Director for Strategy, Policy, and Research. And she's also my friend. So, welcome, Rolake. Once again, Rolake has been here about, I think, 4 times. So I'm super, super grateful.
Yeah, this is actually round number 3 on your show.
It is?
Yeah, and I used to be advisor to the Danish Investment Fund more than a year ago. I'm no longer advisor. So
I see. Apologies.
No
okay.
Problem.
So, like I said, we're talking about effective communication. So, Rolake, what is effective communication?
Right. So, I think the way I would like to start is by giving you a quote, which I found really interesting. And the quote says that the biggest challenge with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Right? The biggest challenge with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So if I want to set that as a backdrop for defining what effective communication is communication that is done in such a way that the receiver of that communication actually understands what has been said, right? So if I say that quote again, the biggest challenge of communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And that illusion usually rests on the part of the person who is communicating. They're communicating to an audience, they're communicating to a person, an individual, but they've communicated and said what they want to say. The question is, did the recipient of that communication actually understand and grasp it? Can they make sense of it? So for me, effective communication is when both the person who is communicating and the object receiver of that communication are fully aligned around the message that has been delivered.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, so how do you assess that?
Okay, so effective communication there are 2 broad principles, which is the verbal and the nonverbal communication. You know, long before human beings started communicating verbally, one of the core tenets of communication was that people would write things on the wall, people would use gestures for each other. And so one way to assess effective communication is whether what I'm saying and whether how I'm saying it, whether through unspoken words, gestures, mood, body language are aligned. And I always say that if what you're saying and how you're saying it are misaligned, your listener or your reader will always believe your nonverbal communication first. Because there's something inbuilt in every one of us. We've learned how to read signals. So if I'm talking to you now, I'm talking to you, Farah, I'm speaking words, but I'm also reading your body language. For instance, parts of your body language could be telling me, Rolake, okay, that's enough. You've been going on and on, right? It's possible that if we come to the end of the show, you'll tell me, okay, we're running out of time. But you won't say we're not running out of time. You may start to fidget. You may start to try and give me eye signals. Now, in my head, I should be able to understand, okay, Farah is trying to message me. She's trying to send me something. So I think one of the ways to really understand whether communication is going on is what people are not saying. It's just as important as what they're saying. So body language is a key part of that. The second part is the intent of communication, right? Intent is a key hallmark of communication. And one of the ways people get into conflict situations or tensions are created is when communication is not contextualized, right? And so I'll give you a very practical example. If I say to you, Farrell, why are you always looking at me like that? Now, somebody who is listening to our communication and comes into this room may not even realize that is banter between friends. They may come in and immediately assume, Rolake, why are you being so rude to this woman? But you and I have a relationship. We have context to this communication. So somebody can take our words in isolation and assume or read or extrapolate several things. So the intent of communication is very important. And I think one of the ways for a communicator or a speaker, however you're communicating verbally via email, is to help your receiver understand intent. And one of the ways to establish intent is to declare intent. It's as simple as that. So if, for instance, I'm sending you a reprimand for not doing something, I say, Farrell, stop doing this. I don't like it. Intent is part of the why. So I can set the context and say to you, Farrell, you know what? In this organization, one of the values we hold to high regard is punctuality. So if I keep shouting at you and I say, stop doing this, and I've not set up the context, which is tied to the intent is I want all of us to be aligned in terms of our organizational values. So me just telling you about your lateness and lack of punctuality may not be as strong and definitive if I don't set the context or intent of the conversation. Now, the final part of communication, which I'm extremely passionate about, is active listening. And I think if you recall, when I said communication is a two-way street, it's about what the recipient understands and what the person is communicating says, is that active listening means that if I communicate with you, most times I expect some sort of response. Usually that response may not happen immediately. It may be I'm speaking in an audience and I want you to go away and think on my words and then act on them, or I'm expecting a response from you. And so in order to truly receive that response, I need to be able to actively and constructively listen, and I need to be emotionally intelligent. And I can go into a bit more details as to how that plays out, particularly in the corporate and organizational context.
I'm sitting down and I'm listening to you and I'm asking myself, okay, is my nonverbal communication right now on cue? Am I doing the wrong thing? Did I was actually trying to actively listen. So if we use you and I as an example right now, would you say that I was receiving your communication? Would you say that my nonverbal was in line?
Yes. Well, I would say on the surface of it, because I'm not a mind reader, I would say, yes, you were listening because you weren't fidgety, and I could see the expressions on your face. As I said certain things, your eyes were kind of speaking to me. So it was also a bit affirming, which is another important principle of communication, because it meant I was on the right track and I could keep going. Now, if I saw you squinting or looking or glancing here, I'd be like, well, okay, maybe you need to curb this communication now.
I see. How do we now bring this into, you had talked about in emails, very briefly, how do we now bring it into communicating via email, communicating with your juniors, your peers, and your superior? How do we unpack that?
Okay, so I will start with email communication in the workplace, because email and written communication are absolutely key. We use emails all the time, but we also have to remember there was a time in our workplaces where email technology wasn't a thing, and we were still able to communicate. Now, my principal cardinal rule for email communication is, if it can be said in person, but it needs to be said on record in writing, say it in person first, then put it on record. Right? I'll repeat that. If it can be said in person, or you have the opportunity to say in person, but as a result of regulation or rules, it needs to be put on record in writing, say it in person first, then follow it with the email communication. And I think this saves us a lot of headache, because the problem with email communication sometimes is it doesn't give us the benefit of this human-to-human face and interactions. We don't have the benefit of reading body language. We don't have the benefit of hearing the tone of voice or the intent behind it, the tone of voice. So we can misconstrue things and take things out of context. The second cardinal rule of email communication is courtesy and protocols. My suggestion for people communicating via email, especially if you're joining an organization where you haven't been fully briefed about the culture or the way of doing things, is If in doubt, err on the side of caution. So if you're not sure whether I should address you as dear Ferron or dear Madam or Mrs. Ferron or Dr. Ferron because I don't know you have a PhD, then by all means add the title, add the protocol. It's better to be corrected and to be told that you're being overly polite or deferential than to be told or perceived as rude or discourteous or lacking deference. And I think that's also an important point. And the final point I'll make about email communication is that never say on record what you cannot say and stand by off record, right? Or let me take it the other way. Never say off record what you cannot put on record. And the reason I say so is that once email has been sent, so long as that undo sign, for instance, if you're using Gmail, right, is no longer there, you can't take it back. Yes, you can recall it, but chances are somebody has read it. And so the word of advice is where you feel hard done by, where you feel somebody has offended you. Something I started to learn, perhaps a bit too late in my corporate career, is I will put my name in the to box and I will type and vent out everything what I want to say and I'll send it to myself. And even that process of just writing out how you feel about something that has happened, how you want to communicate in the situation can help you then rethink when you send it to yourself and you open it and read it and you see how it comes across to you, it can then help you refine your approach in the actual communication you want to send to that person, that manager, or whoever it is. But I'm a big fan of communications alongside email, verbal and person-to-person communication.
Wow. Wow. I've never actually thought about doing it that way. I would sometimes write it in my notes, but I have been caught on the wrong side of it.
We all have at various points.
Yes. So when it relates to your juniors, your peers, and your superiors, how do you effectively communicate so you win as opposed to, keep creating conflict?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very interesting question, Farah, and I think it's all contextual. You have to understand the corporate culture and the culture of the organization. When I joined MIXTA, I was very surprised to learn that we could call our boss, the CEO, using his initials. He gave us the option of saying Deji or DA. But I think it's important to understand that if you want to rise through the leadership ranks in an organization, you have to understand executive communication. And what does that communication look like? So this is now around the philosophy of communication. When you're communicating to your peers, your subordinates, your managers, your seniors, your language always has to have the principle of what I call outcomes. And what does outcomes look like? If I'm communicating to my boss about a project, I also should be communicating what is the intended end of that project, how I hope to achieve it. I should never communicate in such a way that I leave anybody in doubt about my contributions or my ability to solve an issue. So when I coach people and I tell them it's important to adopt what I call leadership language in communication in the workplace. Leadership language is language that is always focused on finding solutions or reaching an outcome from a discussion. So you should never be the person who's communicating and leaving someone in more doubt than when you first met them. So even if you're communicating a difficult situation or a difficult outcome, or you're communicating maybe not so positive feedback around performance, you should take the sandwich approach, right? So what you want to do, you start with, fantastic contributions you made to the business so far. However, there's some aspects of your performance that I think you need to improve and that I'm not so happy with. But having said that, here are ways I can help you improve at the end of the day. So you started constructively and positively. You've then put into this sandwich all the meat and everything, which is really at the heart of what you want to say. And then you close the sandwich back to say, you know what? I will offer training. I will guide you on this journey. That goes back to leadership language, which I said has to be focused on outcomes. And the same thing applies whether you're talking to your subordinates or your peers. I think it's important that with our peers and subordinates, we apply the same level of courtesies in terms of respect, value, boundaries, personal body space, which is another issue I find in corporate Nigeria that can be a bit challenging. People often remember the verbal side of communication, but when you're communicating with people, the issue of familiarity, because colleagues have come to know each other over such a short period, you spend pretty much 90% of your day with your colleagues. Respecting boundaries in communication, physical and personal space boundaries is important. showing people decency and respect, regardless of whether they're your juniors, whether they're a graduate intern, is also important. And I think for me, the final thing I would say in communicating in the workplace is completeness. I think sometimes you have toxic work cultures where people deliberately communicate in such a way that leaves people, reduces their self-esteem, leaves them lacking confidence, leaves them feeling unsure of themselves. One of the 7 C's of communication is completeness. Completeness means that I have to round up that conversation. Ultimately, communication is about human connection. And I never want you to make you feel less than or incapable or incompetent, even if you're perceived as incompetent by objective standards. But my communication should always leaving you feeling optimistic about a situation. And I think those are the best types of ways to communicate in the work context.
As always, we've run out of time, but this has been awesome. And like you ended with completion.
Yes. We now have to complete.
We now have to complete, because from the side of my eye, I'm seeing them saying round up. But as always, talking to you is always amazing. And this has been awesome. It really has. And I was listening to you and I'm like, okay, I could see where I did something wrong, where I could have done it better. So I'm already learning from it, and I can't wait to watch it again. And I'm sure the viewers can't wait to watch it again as well. And I really, really, really hope that a few of you had your pen and notepad and you took down some notes. Or if you didn't, you pressed record, or you've bookmarked it so you can watch it again, because the world we live in today, the way the economy is right now, it's better for us to all win together.
Yes.
Than to, have increased amounts of conflict in the workplace. Like you said, 90% of our time is spent in the workplace. So we've got to get it right.
Yes, indeed we have. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. We've come to the end. Helen and Fumi are going to very quickly round off the show. So please stay with us for a few more minutes. Thank you so much.